Here are two paintings, one by Johannes Vermeer and one by a 20th century forger. Can you guess which one is real and which one is fake? The one on the left is entitled Woman Reading Music, and the one on the right, Woman in Blue Reading a Letter. The last one is painted around 1663 by Johannes Vermeer, and the one on the left was painted by Han van Meegeren in the 1930s. If you ask me, it's a pretty convincing forgery, containing all the iconic elements of a Vermeer painting. The calmness, the balanced composition, the colors, the room where Vermeer painted many of his works, and most importantly, the detailed incorporation of light. No wonder that Van Meegeren could sell his work as an authentic Vermeer painting. But with the benefit of hindsight, we may notice some differences. Here's a close-up of the blue jacket in both paintings. First the one by Van Meegeren, and then the one by Vermeer. Do you notice any differences? Okay, the colors appear somewhat different, but that can still be due to the deterioration and restoration of each painting. In this case, the folds in the clothes are much more pronounced in the painting on the right, which is the one by Van Meegeren. If you look at some of Vermeer's other paintings, you will notice that Vermeer's folds are much less pronounced. In his mind, these strong folds and shadows would distort the calmness and balance in a painting. Okay, that is one fake by Van Meegeren, but there are more, as you can see here. Van Meegeren made a career out of this, a very lucrative one in which he could create fake paintings of famous Dutch Baroque artists like this one. Again, one is a real one by Frans Hals. The other one is by Van Meegeren. Can you guess which one is real? In this case, the one on the right is the original from around 1634 by Frans Hals. So why make a video about a forger? Because Van Meegeren has a very special story. He was actually not caught by anyone for a long time, until there was a major plot twist just at the end of World War II. In May 1945, the Dutch government arrested Van Meegeren for selling a Dutch art treasure to the Nazis. It was particularly related to this painting, Christ with the Adulteress, which one of Van Meegeren's dealers had sold to Rijksmarschall Hermann Göring for a pretty hefty sum equal to about $7 million today. And while I show you some images of the trial of Van Meegeren that took place 2 years later, it is good to know that collaborating with the Nazis during the war could very well lead to the death penalty in the Netherlands at that time. But Van Meegeren came with a surprising defense when he said, "The painting in Göring's hands is not, as you assume, a Vermeer of Delft, but a Van Meegeren. I painted the picture." A smart move, as forgery could only lead to a maximum sentence of 2 years. But while he admitted his forgery, the prosecutor was of course not immediately convinced. After some research, they decided that Van Meegeren had to prove to them that he was a forger. It became a pretty unique event in the prosecution and art history, with Van Meegeren painting a new forgery under the watchful eye of the prosecution. You can see here how Van Meegeren is working on Jesus among the doctors. It convinced the prosecution, and the Nazi collaboration charges were dropped, and Van Meegeren now only faced forgery charges. There was an interesting dynamic there. On the one hand, Van Meegeren was a criminal, but the fact that he had sold a fake to the Nazis also made him a folk hero. At the time of the trial, Van Meegeren was 57 years old. He would eventually be convicted to 1 year in prison, but he died from a heart attack later that year before he could serve his sentence. After his death, his belongings were put to auction, and here you can see a video of his house and some of his possessions. The house was full of paintings, some of them originals by Van Meegeren. Here's an example of such an original, entitled The Deer. And here's another example, entitled Fighting Peacocks. But many of the works in his house were fakes. Van Meegeren may have been a forger, but he was a pretty good one. When he was young, he wanted to become a professional artist, and he had a lot of talents to make it as an artist. But he did not go along with the artistic trends of the day. He did not embrace the modern art movements. Instead, he loved figurative painting and had a special interest in the art from the Dutch Golden Century. But whereas he was a very skillful painter, he missed one thing, which art critics were keen to point out, and that was that his works lacked originality. He thought that the powerful art critics were just looking at the name of the artist and not at the quality of the art itself. So when his works were rejected time and time again, he was thinking of revenge. He moved to a villa in France and he specialized in forging Dutch Baroque art. He acquired canvases from the 17th century, used the same brushes as the artists back in the day did, and came up with innovative methods to make his paint look older. His major success came with the supper at Emmaus. As an example, he used a painting on the same subject by Caravaggio. It was a good idea, as there were only few paintings known by Vermeer, and there was always a suspicion that he must have painted more works than were known. A particular theory was that he would have painted more religious works early in his career, as only one such religious work by Vermeer was known, Christ in the house of Martha and Mary. There was also a theory that Vermeer had gone to Italy, where he would have seen some works by Caravaggio, and as Vermeer's early style showed some slight resemblances with Caravaggio's style, it was a pretty smart idea to come up with a missing work by Vermeer that confirmed those theories. Van Meegeren presented the work to a Dutch art dealer, who presented it to Abraham Bredius, an authority about Vermeer's art. The scholar judged it to be an original by Vermeer, and he even deemed it to be the best work by Vermeer. Now, according to Van Meegeren, his intention was to tell everyone that it was a fake, to prove that he was just as good an artist as the famous Vermeer, and to prove his point that the art critics were just a bunch of fools who knew nothing about art. But the response to his fake was so positive that he could now sell it for an enormous amount to a museum. And this he could not refuse. He actually realized that he had gold in his hands and that he could repeat his trick over and over again and become very, very wealthy. So here's another fake, entitled Monday, painted in a similar style. And yet another one is Isaac blessing Jacob. Because if they believed that the supper at Emmaus was perhaps Vermeer's best work, then these works would probably also be accepted. And with World War II going on, people were restricted in their traveling and they could not easily search expert opinions and comparisons with works abroad. Let's end by showing some more fakes to see if we are able to judge the difference. Here is a portrait of a man from 1653 by Gerard ter Borch and a fake by Van Meegeren. In this case, the original is on the right. And here's perhaps an easier example, which comes from earlier in Van Meegeren's career. Portrait of a young woman on the left and smiling girl on the right, one by Vermeer and one by Van Meegeren. In this case, the quality difference seems quite big, and the one on the right is an early forgery by Van Meegeren. The same goes here. On the left, Vermeer's version of the lace maker, and Van Meegeren's attempt to create another version of the lace maker is on the right. Yet another example of an early fake Vermeer by Van Meegeren, entitled Girl with a Blue Bow. It is perhaps a bit unfair to compare it to Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring, one of the most famous paintings in the world, but it shows that Van Meegeren came a long way from starting with his forgeries to some more convincing ones. Here is Woman Playing the Cittern by Van Meegeren. And here are some authentic Vermeers. As you can see, Van Meegeren's forgery fits nicely in between the other paintings. Vermeer repeatedly painted the musical theme, the room looks similar, even the window is the same, and Van Meegeren applied some tricks to make the painting look worn and damaged over time. At least to me, it's a pretty convincing forgery. Finally, I want to share one more very interesting case. This is the Procurus from 1622 by Dirk van Baburen and a fake version by Van Meegeren. Unlike the previous examples, it is a very close copy of the original. The one on the right is by Van Meegeren. Or is it? In 1960, it was presented to the prestigious Courtauld Institute as a fake by Van Meegeren. But as it was such a good one, there was always some doubt on whether it really was a fake, or perhaps a copy by someone in the studio of Van Baburen. In 2009, a scientific study on it was conducted, and the surprising finding was that no modern pigments were found in the painting. So, it had to be an authentic 17th century painting. Only a follow-up scientific study gave clarity. A sample of the pigments showed an artificial resin known as bakelite. The use of bakelite had the effect of hardening the paint and thus making it difficult to detect that it was actually newer paint that was used. And Van Meegeren was the only forger who used this, so it had to be by him. It only shows how good Van Meegeren was as a forger, that even with modern scientific techniques, it is hard to detect his forgeries. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Han van Meegeren's forgeries. If you want to learn more about this story, there are several books and some movies about his story, and particularly the part where he sold a fake to the Nazis. But here I try to focus on the art by Van Meegeren and how it compared to the originals by the Dutch Baroque artists. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be alerted when new videos are added to this channel. Thanks for watching.